Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Let us now look at this topic, synthesizing evidence. So we are still in the process of conducting systematic literature review. Okay, if you can recall, there are a number of activities, okay, when you conduct a review, whether you are performing a systematic review, SLR, or a mapping study. Okay, there is the last part, okay, the last activity in conducting the review where you need to synthesize the evidence. So this is what this video will emphasize. Alright, we have seen last time how to search studies. Okay, I have shown you how to conduct searching using IEEE Explore and Scopus. And then you have learned about how to select studies, relevant studies. Selecting means you have to know what are the criteria for you to select the studies. You need to identify what is the inclusion criteria, what is the exclusion criteria, and then to assess the studies quality. This step number 3 is only applicable for SLR, not for mapping study. So you can skip this process. For a mapping study. So in particular for your project, you do not need to conduct an assessment of the studies quality. And then based on the studies that are included in the review, in the SLR or mapping study, we need to perform data extraction. So data extraction is the process where you have to read what the study is about. Okay, you have to read the full text. You have to understand an individual study, what it does, okay, what the author is trying to report. At least you read the abstract, the introduction, the methodology, the results, discussion about the findings and the conclusion, and then extract necessary data from the study. And finally, this is the most challenging, I would say, other than the data extraction. Data extraction is the most taxing, the most time-consuming, but synthesis of evidence is something else. Okay, this is where we look at how are we going to make sense of the data that we have extracted. So imagine you have extracted a lot of data, and then how do you combine, the results? We call evidence. Every study, will produce results. Okay, by right, and any empirical studies will have individual findings or results, and there must be a way on how are we going to aggregate, how are we going to integrate, how are we going to combine the findings from all the studies that we have included in our SLR or mapping study. Okay, so for this particular topic, the outcomes at the end of the lecture, students must be able to describe what synthesizing evidence means. Okay, so you must know what is synthesizing evidence, okay, what it takes for one to actually conduct a synthesis of evidence, and then explain available approaches to synthesize evidence. There are a number of strategies, number of approaches or methods to synthesize evidence that we will see, and to demonstrate synthesis of evidence via a group project. Okay, so one of the things that you have to do in order to demonstrate your understanding is to make use of the method that you will learn for the project. Okay, so for your project, which is a mapping study, you have to find out which. Okay, you have to discuss among your team members which of the synthesis method that mostly applicable. And you may use more than one approach. Okay, this is what we are going to see. Right? Okay. So data synthesis is the last step in conducting a review. What it does is that it collates and summarizes the results of the included primary studies. This is one thing. When we talk about data synthesis, or evidence synthesis is the same thing, data synthesis or synthesis evidence, because what we are synthesizing are the data or the evidence. So data and evidence are the same thing. We are referring to the same thing. It's just the terminology. So here we are trying to actually not only summarize. Okay, of course we have to first collect, and we have done that during the extraction process, right? And then when you perform the data synthesis, you have to combine those studies, the data. So data synthesis refers to the process of combining results from multiple studies. So you can imagine that we are now talking about how do we aggregate results or findings from multiple studies. We are talking about more than one study, okay? So let's say one study is producing results. Maybe there are a study that perform experiment on pair programming. Okay, another study perform another experiment on pair programming, but maybe in different university. And then maybe there is another study that perform case study, okay, on pair programming in industry. And then maybe there is another study, okay, that perform a survey about the usefulness or satisfaction of students when they use pair programming for programming subjects. Okay, so you see there are various studies that people do. Okay, for example, with regard to pair programming, this is just an example. So understanding each of those individual studies is one thing. Okay, but when it comes to data synthesis, this is where we have to understand what each of those studies are actually producing. Okay, for example, if maybe three studies report about experiments. Okay, maybe 2 studies in the United States, and maybe 5 studies in New Zealand, and 2 studies from Malaysia, 10 studies from Australia, or 15 studies from UK. So imagine there are many studies. Yeah. Why there are so many studies? Well, it's because everybody can do study. Everybody can conduct an empirical study to understand about certain phenomena. For example, they wanted to see how good pair programming is. They wanted to see whether pair programming can increase students' satisfaction, or whether pair programming, effective or not in improving the software quality in industry, for example, or in the university involving programming subjects. So there are various studies that people would do according to their interests. Okay, so when it comes to trying to synthesize, or combine the results from multiple studies, then we need to understand approaches or methods that we can use that is suitable for us to combine the results, because it is not as that straightforward to combine results. We are talking about aggregating the results. Yeah, when we say aggregating, it's not merely summarizing. Summarizing, you say that, okay, study 1 say da 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 da, study 2 say da 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 da, study 3 say da da da. That is individual summary of findings from each study, but that is not synthesis. That is not enough. When you talk about synthesis, you go deeper. Okay, you go deeper, where you take the findings from study 1, and then you take the findings from study 2, and then you take the findings from study 3. If there are 10 studies, then you have to find ways whether is it possible or not for you to combine the results. Are they similar studies or not? Okay, this is what synthesis evidence is actually talking about. Okay, so the key objectives of data synthesis is to analyze and evaluate multiple studies. Okay, because we have to analyze, we have to evaluate. What do we want to analyze? What we want to evaluate? Many things. Perhaps if our concern is to study effectiveness of something, so we are looking at how certain things is effective. So we wanted to analyze that thing. We wanted to evaluate those things. let's say there is a claim that says that, oh, pair programming is a very good method, and all universities should embark on that because it improves students in understanding pair programming and helps them in not only improving their satisfaction but also improving their grades in programming courses. Well, is that true? So people can claim many things, So the way we evaluate those claims is through that evidence, synthesis evidence or data synthesis. Okay, another objective of data synthesis is to select the appropriate methods for integrating or providing new interpretive explanations about them. Okay, so we are not only talking about summarizing each study, we are thinking about, is there anything that we can understand if we were to combine the results from all these multiple studies? What are they actually saying? Is there any conflicting findings? Maybe study A reports something else. Study B says that something else. So they are not. Let's say they are both doing more or less the same experiment. For example, it's just that they use different subjects or different participants. So they conducted studies at their universities, for example. So when you look at this, at their study, let's say the two studies, and see, wow, why they reported different findings. One says that the approach is good. Another one says that the approach is not good. You see, conflicting evidence, right? So that's why when we do the data synthesis, it is interesting to see these patterns. If there is. If there isn't, that's okay. Right? So the data synthesis, the purpose is just to know that is there any interesting patterns or not? Yeah, from all the various study findings that we have found. Okay. Okay, talking about the types of synthesis. In broad manner, okay, there are two categories of. The first one is what we call as numerical synthesis. The second one is descriptive or narrative synthesis. As the name implies, okay, numerical, this involves numbers. Okay, the first technique to perform synthesis is by performing numerical synthesis. Okay, this is possible if the studies are quantitative in nature. Okay, so this is applicable only for quantitative studies, not applicable for qualitative studies, because we are talking about numbers. Here we are looking at the results, what are the means of variance, what are the standard deviations. Okay, and of course, there are many tools that we can use in order to conduct a meta-analysis. Another technique is so-called descriptive or narrative. Okay, as the name implies, okay, so by nature, the way we do synthesis is just using text or languages, using descriptive languages. So techniques like thematic analysis, grounded theory, meta-ethnography, cross-case analysis. There are many techniques that people have actually encountered to perform descriptive or synthesis evidence. So we will have a look for in detail these two techniques. And for descriptive or narrative synthesis, one can use either Atlas DI or NVivo. This is the common tools used. Okay, so it's important to use tools because it helps us to speed up the process. If you don't have the tools, you can imagine that we have to use a manual method, okay, to do the analysis, which will take, of course, a long time lah. Right?